The thunder of hooves had faded to whispers, and the dust had settled like a shroud over Meridian County's oldest livestock auction house. For 37 years, auctioneer Cassius Merriweather had called out bids from the weathered wooden podium, his voice carrying the weight of tradition and the sting of commerce. But tonight, as the autumn wind rattled the barn doors, he gripped his gavel with trembling fingers and prepared to speak the words that would end an era. "Ladies and gentlemen," Cassius announced, his voice cracking slightly, "we've reached our final lot of the evening. Hell, our final lot ever." The sparse crowd, maybe 40 souls scattered across benches that once held hundreds, shifted uncomfortably. Developers had been circling Meridian like vultures for months, their concrete dreams threatening to pave over everything that made this corner of Kentucky sacred. The barn doors creaked open, and stable hand Demetrius Ashford led in the evening's last horse. She was a mare, clearly past her prime, with a coat the color of burnished copper, and eyes that held stories no human tongue could tell. Her registration papers read Autumn's Requiem, but everyone called her Rusty. She'd been surrendered by the Kellerman estate after old man Kellerman passed, his children too busy with their city lives to care about a horse that couldn't win races or pull carriages anymore. Cassius studied the mare as she stood in the sale ring, her head held high despite the circumstances. Something about her bearing reminded him of his own situation, dignity in the face of disposal. "This here's a 17-year-old quarter-horse mare," he began, though his usual enthusiasm felt forced. "She's got good bloodlines, gentle temperament, perfect for—" "How much to start?" interrupted a voice from the back. Cassius squinted through the harsh fluorescent lights, but couldn't make out the speaker clearly. The voice was young, female, with an edge of desperation that cut through the stale air. "Well, let's start the bidding at $200, Cassius called out, though his heart wasn't in it. $200 for a horse that had probably been worth 10 times that in her prime. It felt like an insult. A hand shot up from the third row. Cassius recognized Jebediah Thornton, a local meat buyer who'd been particularly active tonight. The old-timers in the crowd knew what that meant, and several shifted uncomfortably in their seats. When horses went to Jebediah, they didn't go to pastures. "200, I have 200, Cassius announced mechanically. "Do I hear 250? The mysterious voice from the back called out again. 300! Cassius's eyes found her this time, a young woman, maybe 25, with mud-stained jeans and calloused hands. She sat alone in the back row, leaning forward with an intensity that seemed to electrify the stale air. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her green eyes never left the mare in the ring. 300 from the lady in the back, Cassius announced, feeling the first spark of genuine interest he'd had all evening. "Do I hear 350? Jebediah's hand went up immediately. The meat buyer's expression was all business, cold and calculating. Around the barn, a few of the long-time horse people began to take notice. This wasn't just another sale anymore. This was a battle, and everyone could sense it. The tension in the barn thickened like smoke as the bidding war commenced. Cassius found himself caught between two worlds, the harsh reality of commerce, and something deeper, more primal. He'd presided over thousands of auctions, but this felt different. The mare, Rusty, stood in the center ring as if she understood that her fate hung in the balance of raised hands and called numbers. 350 to Jebediah, Cassius announced, his voice carrying across the barn. "Do I hear 400? The young woman's hand shot up without hesitation. 400! Her voice carried a desperation that made several heads turn. Cassius noticed that her hands were shaking slightly, and he wondered if she had any idea what she was getting into, bidding against a man who made his living buying horses by the pound. Jebediah didn't even pause. 450, he called out, his tone flat and businesslike. He'd done this dance before, outlasting emotional bidders until they reached their breaking point. But something in the young woman's posture suggested she wasn't going to fold easily. From the crowd, whispers began to ripple through the scattered attendees. Old-timer Beauregard Mullins leaned over to his neighbor. "That's Kestrel Hawthorne," he murmured, his weathered voice carrying just far enough. Used to work for the Castellano Ranch before it went under. Girls got away with horses, but ain't got two nickels to rub together. Cassius's heart sank a little. He'd hoped the mysterious bidder might be some wealthy horse lover looking for a pasture pet. But if this was Kestrel Hawthorne, and he'd heard the stories about the Castellano Ranch collapse, then she was probably bidding with grocery money. 500. Kestrel called out, her voice stronger now. She'd risen from her seat and Cassius could see the determination written across her face. This wasn't just about buying a horse. This was about something deeper, something that spoke to the very reason people like her couldn't walk away from animals in need. Jebediah's eyes narrowed. He'd been planning to quit around 400, but something about the girl's defiance irritated him. 550, he countered, crossing his arms over his barrel chest. The mare in the ring had been standing quietly throughout the proceedings, but now she turned her head toward Kestrel, as if she could sense the young woman's intentions. For a moment, their eyes met across the dusty space and something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement that sometimes the world came down to moments like these. 600, Kestrel said, and her voice broke, slightly on the words. Several people in the crowd exchanged concerned glances. That was serious money for someone in her position. Cassius felt the weight of his role as auctioneer pressing down on him. He'd always prided himself on being impartial, on letting the market decide. But tonight, with his own livelihood ending, and this young woman fighting for something that mattered to her, the rules felt different. 600 from Kestrel, he announced, then paused. Jebediah, do I hear 650? The meat buyer studied Kestrel for a long moment, his calculating eyes taking in her obvious emotional investment in the outcome. Then, with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes, he raised his hand. 700. A collective intake of breath swept through the barn. $700 for a 17-year-old mare was approaching the realm of foolishness, especially when everyone knew where Jebediah's horses ended up. Kestrel's face went pale, but her jaw set with determination. She looked down at her hands, probably calculating whatever meager resources she had left. The barn fell silent except for the sound of wind through the old boards and the soft shuffle of the mare's hooves in the sawdust. 700 going once, Cassius said quietly, his usual rapid-fire auction cadence slowing to a funeral pace. He found himself hoping against hope that somehow, someway, this story wouldn't end the way they all knew it would. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Cassius held his gavel aloft, knowing that in seconds he'd have to bring it down and seal the mare's fate. Kestrel stood frozen in the back row, her face a mask of anguish as she stared at the horse that had somehow become the focal point of everything she believed in. 700 going twice, Cassius said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words felt like lead in his mouth. Just as his arm began to descend, a new voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. $1,000. Every head in the barn swiveled toward the entrance, where a figure stood silhouetted against the parking lot lights. As the man stepped into the fluorescent glare, Cassius recognized him immediately. Booker Ravenswood, owner of the largest horse rescue operation in 3 counties. Ravenswood was a legend in these parts, a man who'd made his fortune in tech, before retiring early to save animals that others had given up on. Booker! Cassius breathed into his microphone, and the name rippled through the crowd like electricity. Folks, we have a bid of $1,000 from Booker Ravenswood. Jebediah's face darkened. He'd tangled with Ravenswood before, and it never ended well for the meat buyer. But 1,000 was serious money, even for him. He studied the rescue operator for a long moment, then shook his head and waved his hand dismissively. That's your show, Ravenswood, he called out. I'm done. But Ravenswood wasn't looking at Jebediah. His eyes were fixed on Kestrel, who stood, trembling in the back row, tears streaming down her face. Actually, Ravenswood said, his voice carrying clearly through the barn, I'm not bidding for myself. I'm bidding for Miss Hawthorne there. The barn erupted in confused murmurs. Cassius found himself at a loss for words. In 37 years of auctioneering, he'd never seen anything quite like this. I'm sorry, Booker, But I don't understand. Are you bidding or not? Ravenswood walked slowly toward the ring, his boots echoing in the sudden quiet. I'm bidding, he said, but the horse goes to Kestrel. I'm just covering her bid. He stopped directly in front of the mare, who nickered softly and stretched her neck toward him. You see, this old girl and I have some history. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a faded photograph, holding it up for those nearby to see. This is Autumn's requiem when she was 3 years old, winning her first barrel racing competition. The rider on her back is my daughter, Clementine. The crowd pressed closer, and Cassius could see the resemblance now. The mare's distinctive white blaze, the alert ears, the proud stance. But there was something in Ravenswood's voice, a weight that suggested the story wasn't entirely happy. Clementine died in a car accident 5 years ago, Ravenswood continued, his voice steady but soft. She was coming home from college for Christmas break. I sold Rusty after the funeral, couldn't bear to look at her, couldn't handle the memories. Biggest mistake I ever made. Kestrel had moved closer during Ravenswood's speech, and now she stood just a few feet away from both men. Mr. Ravenswood, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I can't let you buy her for me. I don't have any way to pay you back. Ravenswood turned to face her, and Cassius could see the pain and hope warring in the older man's eyes. Miss Hawthorne, I've been watching you work with horses for the past 2 years. I know what happened at the Castellano Ranch wasn't your fault. I also know that you've got a gift with animals that can't be taught. He gestured toward the mare, who was now nuzzling. Kestrel's outstretched hand. Rusty here has been through 4 different owners since I sold her. None of them understood what she needed. But I can see that you do. The barn had grown completely quiet except for the soft sounds of horse and human connecting. Even Jebediah had stopped his grumbling and was watching the scene unfold with something approaching respect. So here's what I'm proposing, Ravenswood said, addressing both Kestrel and the crowd. Miss Hawthorne, you take Rusty home tonight. No payment, no strings attached, but I have a job offer for you. Kestrel's hand stilled on the mare's neck, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and disbelief. The barn seemed to hold its collective breath as Ravenswood continued, his words measured and deliberate. I've been thinking about expanding my rescue operation, he said, his gaze never leaving Kestrel's face. But I need someone who understands horses the way you do, someone who can see past the surface to what an animal really needs. I've heard about your work at Castellanos, how you could gentle the most fractured horses, how you never gave up on the ones others rode off. Cassius found himself leaning forward on his podium, caught up in the drama unfolding in his ring. This wasn't just a horse sale anymore. It was a moment of redemption, the kind of story that made all the years of watching animals change hands worthwhile. What kind of job? Kestrel asked, her voice barely audible. She was still stroking Rusty's neck, and the mare had relaxed completely under her touch, as if she knew she was finally safe. Head trainer and rehabilitation specialist, Ravenswood replied. I've got 43 horses on my property right now, most of them cases that other rescues couldn't handle. Abused animals, traumatized ones, horses that have forgotten how to trust humans. You'd have complete authority over their care and training, plus a salary that would let you keep Rusty in the style she deserves. From the crowd, old Beauregard, Mullins let out a low whistle. Booker Ravenswood don't make offers like that lightly, he murmured to his neighbor. Girl's got herself a guardian angel, but Kestrel was shaking her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. Mr. Ravenswood, you don't understand. I failed at Castellanos. The ranch went under partly because I couldn't save enough horses fast enough. The insurance company blamed me for the incident with Tempest's Pride, said I should have known he was too dangerous to work with. I can't. Stop, Ravenswood said firmly, stepping closer. I know exactly what happened at Castellanos, and it wasn't your fault. Tempest's Pride was a stallion with a brain tumor, something no one could have diagnosed until it was too late. You saved 12 horses from that fire, Kestrel. 12 animals that are alive today because you refused to leave them behind. Cassius felt a chill run down his spine. He remembered the Castellano ranch fire. It had made headlines across the state. But he hadn't known about Kestrel's role in the rescue, or the aftermath that had apparently destroyed her reputation in the horse community. The insurance company needed someone to blame, Ravenswood continued, and you were an easy target. But I've talked to the firefighters who were there that night. They said you went back into that burning barn 4 times, carrying out horses, that everyone else had given up for dead. That's not failure, Miss Hawthorne. That's heroism. Rusty had been standing quietly throughout the exchange, but now she turned her head and fixed her dark eyes on Kestrel. For a moment, woman and horse regarded each other with an understanding that transcended words. Then the mare took a step forward and gently pressed her forehead against Kestrel's chest. She remembers, Ravenswood said softly. Horses never forget kindness, and they never forget someone who truly understands them. Rusty knows what I know, that you're exactly the person she's been waiting for. Kestrel closed her eyes and wrapped her arms around the mare's neck. When she opened them again, there was something different in her expression, a spark of the confidence that had made her legendary among horse people before the world came crashing down. If I say yes, she said quietly, what happens to all? The horses at your rescue? What if I can't help them? What if I let you down the way I let everyone else down? Ravenswood smiled, and for the first time since entering the barn, he looked genuinely happy. Miss Hawthorne, failure is when you stop trying. Everything else is just learning. My daughter used to say that Rusty here was the smartest horse she'd ever known. Smart enough to choose her own riders, smart enough to know who she could trust. And right now, she's choosing you. The barn erupted in spontaneous applause, startling several people who hadn't realized they were clapping until the sound filled the air. Even Jebediah was nodding approvingly, his earlier antagonism forgotten. In the face of something larger than commerce, Cassius raised his gavel one final time. Well, folks, I think we have ourselves a deal that's worth a lot more than money. 3 months later, the morning sun painted golden streaks across the paddocks of Ravenswood Rescue Ranch, illuminating a scene that would have seemed impossible during that final auction at Meridian County. Kestrel stood at the fence line, watching. Rusty worked with a young colt named Phoenix who'd arrived just weeks earlier, a horse so traumatized by neglect that he'd initially refused to let any human within 50 feet. She's teaching him to trust again, Ravenswood observed, joining Kestrel at the fence. In the paddock, Rusty moved with patient grace around the skittish colt, her body language calm and reassuring. Whenever Phoenix showed signs of panic, the older mare would position herself between him and whatever had frightened him, offering protection without force. It's remarkable, Kestrel murmured, her voice filled with wonder that hadn't dimmed despite witnessing similar miracles daily. She seems to know exactly what each horse needs. Yesterday I watched her spend 4 hours just standing next to Wistba, not moving, not demanding anything, just being present until that little filly finally felt safe enough to eat. The transformation in Kestrel herself had been equally remarkable. The broken young woman from the auction had evolved into a confident professional whose reputation was spreading throughout the region. Horse owners from 5 states were calling, hoping to bring their troubled animals to someone who could work miracles. Speaking of miracles, Ravenswood said, pulling an envelope from his shirt pocket, you might want to see this. Kestrel opened the letter, her eyes widening as she read. It was from the State Veterinary Board, officially clearing her of any wrongdoing in the Castellano Ranch incident. New evidence had emerged, veterinary records proving that Tempest's Pride had indeed suffered from an undiagnosed brain tumor, exactly as Ravenswood had claimed. How did you? She began, but Ravenswood held up a hand. Sometimes justice takes time, he said simply, but it usually finds its way to the people who deserve it. A horn honked from the ranch entrance, and they looked up to see a familiar truck pulling into the driveway. Cassius Merriweather climbed out, his weathered face breaking into a grin as he spotted them by the paddock. Cassius, Kestrel called out, jogging over to greet the former auctioneer. What brings you out here? The old man's eyes sparkled with mischief. Well, I've got some news that I think might interest both of you. He gestured toward his truck, where Kestrel could now see several boxes loaded in the bed. Remember how everyone thought the Meridian County auction house was done for? Turns out the developers weren't the only ones interested in the property. Ravenswood raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I mean, Cassius said, unable to contain his excitement any longer, that a group of local ranchers pooled their money and bought the place. They're turning it into a cooperative auction house, one that specializes in rescue placements and therapeutic horse sales, and they want me to run it. Kestrel felt her heart skip a beat. Cassius, that's wonderful, but what does that have to do with us? The old auctioneer's grin widened. They want to partner with Ravenswood Rescue Ranch. Every month we'd hold a special auction featuring horses that are ready for adoption, animals that have been rehabilitated and are looking for their forever homes. The proceeds would help fund more rescue operations. The idea was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of being a place where unwanted horses went to meet uncertain fates, the auction house would become a celebration of second chances, a place where broken animals found healing homes. There's more, Cassius continued. The story of what happened that night with Rusty and you and Booker, it's gotten around. People are calling it the miracle auction, and everyone wants to be part of something like that. We've already got commitments from families who want to adopt, trainers who want to volunteer, even corporations willing to sponsor rehabilitation programs. Kestrel looked back at the paddock, where Rusty was now grazing peacefully beside Phoenix, who had finally relaxed enough to eat. The sight filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the morning sun. You know what this means? She said, turning back to the two men who had become her unexpected family. It means that night at the auction wasn't an ending at all. It was the beginning of something bigger than any of us imagined. Ravenswood nodded, his eyes reflecting the same amazement that had carried them all through the past few months. Sometimes the best stories start with someone saying, "Final call." 1 year after the night that changed everything, the Meridian County Cooperative Auction House buzzed with activity that would have amazed anyone who remembered its final, desperate evening. The renovated barn gleamed with fresh paint and modern lighting, but the soul of the place remained unchanged. The smell of hay and horses, the creak of old wood, the sense of community that only comes when people gather around something they love. Cassius stood at his familiar podium, but tonight his voice carried joy instead of resignation. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our 12th monthly adoption auction. Tonight we're featuring 15 horses, all rehabilitated through the Ravenswood Rescue Ranch program, all looking for their forever homes. The crowd was 3 times larger than that final night a year ago. Families filled the benches, children pressed against the rails of the sale ring, and the air hummed with anticipation rather than despair. In the VIP section, a new addition to honor major donors, sat representatives from 3 different rescue organizations that had been inspired to start their own programs. Our first horse tonight, Cassius announced as the barn doors opened, is a very special young gelding named Phoenix. Some of you might remember him as the horse that was too traumatized to let humans approach. Well, let me introduce you to his trainer. Kestrel entered the ring leading Phoenix, who moved with the confidence of a horse who had rediscovered trust. The crowd erupted in applause, not just for the transformation of the horse, but for the young woman who had become something of a legend in the regional horse community. Phoenix here was found in a field, abandoned and afraid, Kestrel said, her voice carrying clearly through the barn. When he arrived at Ravenswood Ranch, he wouldn't let anyone within arm's reach, but with patience, consistency, and the help of a very wise teacher, he learned that not all humans want to hurt him. As if on cue, Rusty appeared in the doorway, led by one of the ranch volunteers. The crowd's applause doubled in volume. Over the past year, Rusty had become the unofficial mascot of the rescue operation, her story inspiring newspaper articles, social media posts, and even a documentary that was currently making the rounds at film festivals. Rusty has personally mentored 12 horses through their rehabilitation, Kestrel continued, stroking Phoenix's neck as the young horse stood calmly despite the crowd and noise. She teaches them things that humans can't. How to be horses. Again, how to find peace in their own bodies. How to trust their instincts while still accepting human guidance. The bidding for Phoenix was spirited but friendly. 3 families had already been pre-approved for adoption, and the auction was more of a celebration than a competition. When the gavel fell at 1 or 200, all of which would go directly to fund more rescue operations, Phoenix's new family rushed forward to meet their new companion. As the evening progressed, horse after horse found loving homes. A gentle mare named Luna went to a therapeutic riding program. A spirited gelding called Comet was adopted by a teenage girl who'd been saving her babysitting money for 2 years. Each story was a victory, each placement a promise that the cycle of healing would continue. But the real surprise came at the end of the evening. Cassius returned to his podium with a mysterious smile, the same expression he'd worn that night when everything began. "Now, folks, we have one more announcement before we close," he said, raising his hand for quiet. "As many of you know, the success of this program has attracted attention from around the country. We've received funding to expand the operation significantly, and we're going to need more help." Ravenswood stepped into the ring, followed by several people Kestrel didn't recognize. "I'd like to introduce Dr. Magnolia Whitmore from the University of Kentucky's veterinary program," he said, gesturing to a distinguished woman in her 50s. "Dr. Whitmore has been studying our rehabilitation methods, and she's convinced the university to establish a new degree program in equine trauma therapy." The crowd murmured with interest, but Kestrel felt a flutter of nervousness. Change had been good to her so far, but she'd learned to be wary of surprises. "Miss Hawthorne," Dr. Whitmore said, stepping forward, "your work with traumatized horses has redefined what we thought was possible in equine rehabilitation. The university would like to offer you a position as a clinical instructor in the new program. You'd continue your work at Ravenswood Ranch, but you'd also teach the next generation of horse therapists." Kestrel felt her knees go weak. Teaching at a university had never been part of her dreams. She'd never even finished her own degree after the Castellano Ranch collapse. "I'm honored," she managed, "but I'm not sure I'm qualified." "Miss Hawthorne," Dr. Whitmore interrupted gently, "you've rehabilitated over 60 horses in the past year. You've developed techniques that are being studied by veterinary schools across the country. The only thing you're missing is a piece of paper, and we can fix that easily enough." The crowd erupted in applause, but Kestrel barely heard it. She was looking at Rusty, who stood in the ring as if she knew exactly what was happening. The mare's dark eyes seemed to hold all the wisdom of their shared journey, from that desperate night at the auction to this moment of impossible possibility. "What do you think, girl?" Kestrel whispered, moving to Rusty's side. "Ready to teach some college kids how it's really done?" Rusty nickered softly and nuzzled Kestrel's shoulder, her answer as clear as words. Some stories end with, "going once, going twice sold." But the best stories, the ones that matter, end with, "and they lived happily ever after," helping others find their own happy endings. As the crowd began to disperse and the lights started to dim, Kestrel stood in the ring, with Rusty surrounded by the evidence of what was possible when people refused to give up on each other. The barn that had once echoed with desperation now rang with hope, and tomorrow would bring new horses, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that sometimes the most broken things can be made whole again. The auctioneer had indeed called final horse that night a year ago, but what he'd really been announcing was the beginning of something beautiful, a place where endings became beginnings, where lost souls found their way home, and where the simple act of refusing to give up could change the world one horse at a time.